Last week in our homily, we explored Latin. And this week in our fourth homily on the liturgy, we're going to explore, you guessed it, Latin. You might be thinking, Lord have mercy. Last week we talked about what the church teaches in regards to Latin. And today I'd like to explore one primary reason for this teaching and a little bit of the history of Latin in the church. I'm indebted to two scholars for this homily. Much of my information comes from them. A Michael Fredericks and a Dr. Joseph Shaw. I want to acknowledge that the use of Latin within the Mass is sometimes a hot topic. Some can sometimes struggle with the thought of including more Latin in the Mass. I think one of the reasons we sometimes struggle with the use of Latin is because we might have what's called a utilitarian view of language. Utilitarian means practical or useful. And so if anything is not deemed useful or practical, we just get rid of it. We see that a lot in our culture, and it's a big problem. A utilitarian view of language sees language solely as a means of communication. You say one thing, I get it. An exchange of ideas. Practical, useful, immediate. And because Latin takes effort to understand and because it's not immediately useful, there's a tendency to want to get rid of it without considering the reasons why we had it in the first place. We can forget in our modern culture that language has higher goals than just communication. We see this in poetry and in song. If you hear a good poem, and I hope you do from time to time, our hearts can be moved by the beauty of it, by the joining, the phrasing of the words. In many instances, we may not even grasp the full meaning of the poem. A deeper research is needed. But we can still hold its beauty when we hear it. And so language, besides communication, has the ability to move our hearts to something higher, to what we call transcendentals. Help us to contemplate the beauty, the divine. Language can become something like art. Language is not just for practical communication. It has loftier goals. And it's in this context that Latin should be considered. It's why linguists, those who study languages, they talk about registers of language or octaves of language, each one higher than the other. For example, the lowest register of language is slang, the kind of language you might use at a restaurant, or the conversation had between high school students. Half the time, I don't know what you're saying, bro. The next register of language, a little bit higher, is common communication or common conversation, the likes of which we might do after Mass. It's a little more refined, or it should be. The next register of language is more formal language, the language of presentation, of scientific endeavor, of academia, of poetry even. And in our culture, we have to know what register we're in. We shouldn't be using slang at work. And moreover, we do not use academic language in common conversation. We have to know the register, the octave. But there is yet one higher register of language, one which our Western utilitarian world has forgotten about. That's the language of worship, sacred language. And for the Western Roman Catholic Church, for 1600 years, that language was Latin. The worship of God is our highest endeavor. Nothing can top the worship of God and what we do here. It follows then we use the highest register of language, one that's different from our everyday life. When we include Latin in the Mass, it automatically reminds us that this isn't the grocery store. It's not a presentation at the university. It reminds us what we're doing here is divine. It's holy. It's one of the primary reasons the Church uses Latin, a sacred language set apart for God. The highest register, because God deserves our best. And we see this in the early church. There's a misconception out there that the Catholic Church adopted Latin only because it was the vernacular of the people at the time in the early church. There's some truth to this, but it's not the whole truth. In the early church, Mass would have first been celebrated in Greek. Then in the 4th and the 5th centuries, it transitioned to Latin. But when Latin became the official language of the Mass, what's interesting is this. Are you guys still with me? I hope so. Okay. When Latin was chosen by the church, they didn't use ordinary everyday Latin. It wasn't like the common vernacular. It was a higher register of Latin. The Latin chosen or created by the church was filled with old archaic words that people didn't use anymore and maybe didn't understand. Much like our old English words, art, thou, we beseech thee, vouchsafe. The Latin they used was also filled with a mixture of Hebrew words and Greek words. And so it's clear the Latin used in the early church was not a mere vernacular. It was meant to be something higher, something sacred, something set apart. Immediate comprehension was not the sole purpose of the church adopting Latin. The most important purpose was the sacred language. And this development of the sacred language was done not only by the church in the West, but as the church spread to the East, sacred languages developed there. In the East, what is modern-day Russia, a church Slavonic developed. The Greek church used an ancient Greek. The Coptics developed their own Coptic liturgical language. Everyone knew and desired this sacred language set apart for God. Those languages are still used to this day by those churches. But we in the West adopted Latin. It's good for us to remember that sacred language has its role in salvation history in the Bible. Because you will recall that Jesus himself used a sacred language. His common tongue, his vernacular was Aramaic. But he knew all his prayers in Hebrew. For the longest time, Jewish children learned their prayers both in the vernacular and their sacred language of Hebrew. And the church adopted this practice by adopting sacred Latin. And so I hope we can see it, the importance of Latin as a sacred language. The highest register, it tells us something else is going on here. The highest endeavor. Therefore, we give a language to the worship of God. And like poetry, the use of Latin is an expression of art. It can move our hearts to contemplate the divine. There are many more reasons why the church uses Latin. Namely, the devil doesn't like it. I have a few stories on that. It's a great unifier, and it saves us from theological error. In closing, I'd like to share with you the words of the great Cardinal Lorenzi from Nigeria. Our Nigerian family should be proud of him. When he was prefect of the discipline of the sacraments in 2007, under John Paul II, he wrote this, published in the Vatican's newspaper. It seems no one remembers it. And I quote, "We should do our best to appreciate the Latin language, which the Church uses in her liturgy. All of us cannot be Latin speakers, but the lay faithful can at least learn the responses in Latin. A priest should give more attention so that they celebrate Mass in Latin occasionally. Big churches where there are many Masses celebrated on Sunday, why can one of these Masses not be celebrated in Latin? In rural parishes, a Mass in Latin should possibly be said once a month." End quote. Seems like a sensible pastoral suggestion from the great cardinal from Nigeria. And with proper catechism and preparation and resources, it's something that the universal church would do well to work towards. For Latin is our sacred language. God bless you, God love you. Amen.